And as I mentioned last week, it's difficult to do any other kind of books than these Old Testament books like this, to go through as many verses as we do, and would never in a million years try to go through chapters at a time like we are doing through the book of Daniel. With the New Testament or Pauline epistles, anything like that. We're able to do that, though, because these chapters are narrative chapters. And really, you have to have the whole chapter in there to be able to get the whole story. And yes, we could pull out a verse or two here and talk about those verses, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for the sake of the storyline, for the sake of what God is trying to teach us here, we've been taking a chapter at a time almost every week. And that's going to continue next week as well, as we come to the famous Daniel chapter number 6 with Daniel in the lion's den. One of the most famous, we talked in this Sunday school this morning, was David and Goliath, one of those stories that everybody knows about. You know, Brother Danny mentioned it's one of those things. I don't care if it seems like every time you take a kid to junior church one time and they're going to hear about David and Goliath. Well, Daniel and the lion's den is another one of those stories that everybody knows about. Kids learn very soon, very early on in their spiritual lives. And so, but as we get a little bit older, I hope you understand all the stories that you learned about when you were a kid, and all the stories that we teach our children at home, and they're taught here at school. All those things are just as applicable to adults as they are to young people. And yes, I know some appeal to young people maybe more than they do adults. I mean, who doesn't like a story of a giant against a boy, and who doesn't like the story of a man being thrown into a den of lions, and hungry, ravenous lions, and surviving? Spoiler alert, surviving. Who doesn't like that type of stuff, right? Well, I mean, I think adults like that type of stuff too, but there's so many practical lessons for us to learn from that. But before we get to Daniel 6, we don't want to skip over Daniel chapter 5. And I've titled the message this morning, God's Graffiti. God's Graffiti. Now, I know we may not see a whole lot of graffiti necessarily around here in Fayette. Okay, we have a lot of murals. I don't think it's graffiti. I consider graffiti most of the time just vandalism, and those that try to just mark up any open space. But you go to a larger city, you go to Birmingham, especially New York City or places like that, and every open space that you see on a building or a bridge, you'll see graffiti written. Well, here in Daniel chapter number 5, we're going to see graffiti. But it's not just normal graffiti. This is divine graffiti we're going to see. We're going to see, and by the way, it doesn't use a spray paint can, okay? It doesn't use any type of normal paint. We're going to see a supernatural writing on the wall here in Daniel chapter number 5. Now let's set the scene this morning, because it's a pretty neat story. The year is 539 BC. The place that we're going to be looking at is the royal palace of Babylon. Now, to set the timing for you, almost 70 years have passed since the day that Daniel and the other Jewish teenagers arrived from Jerusalem. Daniel now is close to 80 years old at this time. So Daniel is no longer a boy. Daniel is an old man at this point. Some 20 years have passed just between chapter 4 and chapter 5. By the way, some of you, I saw some looks when I said 80, an old man, okay? No offense, okay? If you're 80 years old or above, okay, you're still spry and right in the golden years, okay? That no offense by the old man. Just Daniel was an old man, okay? Not you. Daniel was an old man. So 20 years have passed just between chapter 4 and chapter 5. So what's happened? If you remember in chapter 4, what happened? Nebuchadnezzar was humbled in a tremendous way. For 7 years he ate the grass of the field like a wild animal. His hair grew out. His nails got sharp like birds' claws. And then his mind came back to him, and I believe he turned to God. Of course, again, debatable. All day long we could spend time talking about that. We're not going to today. But he was humbled, and he turned to God. Well, since then, he has passed away. And after Nebuchadnezzar's death, it did not take long for greed and ambition to run rampant in the royal family, as is often the case. And so just looking at history, okay, the Bible doesn't tell us all these things, but looking at history, we know that after Nebuchadnezzar's death, his son, and the guy's name was, it's spelled evil, E-V-I-L, and I don't know if it's pronounced evil, but it's Evil Merodach was his name. He reigned only 2 years before his power-hungry brother-in-law, General Neriglissar, who was a son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar, assassinated him and became king. Of course, we see a lot of dysfunction in most families, or all families, but especially these royal families. Then after a 6-year reign, Neriglissar died, and his young son, Labashi Marduk, stepped into power. He only lasted a few months before he got killed by another son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar by the name of Nabonidus. Now, we actually mentioned the name Nabonidus back a couple of weeks ago, or it might have been last week when I talked about a historical document that's been found that shows, I think it was called the Song of Nabonidus, that talks about a king who goes crazy for 7 years and is finally humbled and comes back to the Lord. And again, we don't know if 100% if that's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, but it seems very close to what the story entails, and so we would think it would have to be. But Nabonidus spent most of his reign away from Babylon. His job was to secure the borders, to strengthen the empire, while his son, Belshazzar, was co-ruler. He handled all the day-to-day operations, if you will, of the kingdom. Now, as we're going to see in just a minute, when you read the first couple of verses, you're going to see the Bible says that Nebuchadnezzar was the father of Belshazzar. I do not believe in all my study and all my research that that Belshazzar was actually the son of Nebuchadnezzar. Now you say, you calling the Bible a liar? No, I'm not calling the Bible a liar. I'm saying that the word father that's used there can be used for grandfather and other terms as well. I believe that Nebuchadnezzar was Belshazzar's grandfather. That's what I believe. Now again, can be debatable, not a hill worth dying on. Just want you to be aware of what's going on here. So, Nabonidus and Belshazzar are co-ruling, if you will. Nabonidus is the one on the ground, boots on the ground, getting stuff done. Belshazzar is the one back at home, trying to run the day-to-day operations. Well, they live in the city of Babylon, was a very heavily fortified city. And Belshazzar thought that his kingdom was impenetrable. He thought it was safe. No doubt. Why wouldn't he? If you do some research, Nebuchadnezzar built the city to withstand any siege. Its walls were actually 15 square miles, constructed of brick. It was 350 feet high, and it was wide enough for 4 chariots side by side to ride across. So pretty much you could put a freeway, an interstate on top of the wall. It was so big. Why wouldn't you think you were safe? Why wouldn't you think it was impenetrable? There was a canal that was channeled off from the Euphrates River that ran right through the city. They didn't have to go out for water. They dug a channel, and they had the Euphrates run right under them. They built walls on top of the river so nobody could get in. You couldn't flow in there in a boat. I mean, it was safe. If that wasn't enough, there was an estimated 100 towers that were built along this wall to provide the Babylonian military an advantage in case there was a fight. Now, Belshazzar is home in these walled gates thinking he is safe. What could possibly happen to him? I mean, there has never been an invader that has stormed the city for over 1,000 years. The problem is here in Daniel chapter 5, that's about to change. In the distance, outside the walls, the Medo-Persian king Cyrus and his army were coming down to Babylon. And history tells us that Belshazzar's father Nabonidus and his army met them there on the Tigris River, and they had a great battle, and one where Nabonidus' troops had to retreat, and it gave free access to Babylon. But still, yet inside the city, there's Belshazzar, and he's happy, and he's safe, and he's we say fat and happy. He's living it up. He's got everything to live for, if you will. He was not concerned that the enemy would ever be able to come into the city. Even when the enemy surrounded the city, that's what really the setting is. Belshazzar's in the city, and the Medo-Persians have surrounded the city. He's still not bothered. How are they going to get in? Nobody's ever gotten in 1,000 years. I am safe. Nothing could ever happen to me. And by the way, even if we have to stay in here and can't go out for supplies, we have enough supplies for 20 years inside these walls. Now, they were talking about doomsday prepping, right? They were ready. They were all about, they were good to go. But to show his foolish arrogance, if you will, he decides to throw a party for over 1,000 people. And that's the setting. That's the background we come to in the events of Daniel 5. So let's dive in, and it begins with, number 1, a scandalous dinner. A scandalous dinner. Look at chapter 5 and look at verse 1. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. By the way, the Bible mentions 1,000, but after the time that you count wives and waiters and other guests that are probably there, it's probably closer to 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people that were probably at this party. Verse 2, Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. Now, time out. Let's stop right there. Secular history tells us, according to secular history, the date of this night, we even have the date because we know when the Medo-Persians conquered the Babylonians, was October 12th, pretty close to where we are right now, 539 BC. Now, again, all over the city, people are excited because the king is throwing this massive party, and he invites over 1,000 nobles. But I told you, by the time everybody's there, it's probably 8,000 people that are there. And what he's doing is that he's trying to divert the people's attention away to what's happening outside the city walls, isn't he? What a good leader, right? Hey, he don't want his people freaking out, so hey, let's throw a big old shindig, right? Let's have booze, let's have women, let's have a great party. What more do you need? And everybody's mind is taken off of the Medo-Persians right outside the gate. So they have food, wine, and women. And a bunch of them. I mean, no expenses were spared. I mean, this was a lavish event. Probably one that went all day, probably early in the morning till way after midnight, early into the morning the next day. Now, evidently, the party got off to a great start. There was lots of laughter. There was a lot of great conversation around the tables, plenty of wine for everyone. And no one knows why, but somewhere along the way, after a good bit of wine got into Belshazzar, he decided to up the ante a little bit. He said, hey, let's go get all the silver and gold goblets that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem over 70 years ago when we conquered them. Let's go get those. Let's drink wine out of those. So somewhere these goblets that were taken from the temple, God's house, have been stored somewhere in the royal palace there in Babylon. And he decides on a drunken binge to say, hey, go get these things. I want to drink out of those golden and silver goblets. And so the king calls his servants over and he whispers in their ear the command. And they nod and they disappear and they come back a few minutes later returning with these goblets. You can imagine all the oohs and ahs in the crowd as he brings these in. Look at me. I'm about to drink out of these. These special cups that are here. And they pass the goblet from one person to another. First the king, then his wives, then his concubines, then all the nobles there of Babylon drank from the holy goblets that had been taken from the temple of Jerusalem. Really just rubbing his face, slapping the face to God Almighty. Then the Bible tells us that they began to praise the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. I almost picture them begin to start, as they're drinking out of these goblets to the one true God, they start to sing these songs praising these gods of all these other materials that, of course, don't mean anything. There was shouting. There was laughter. There was a bunch of degenerate things. Really, I don't believe it would be, if we use the word orgy, I don't think we'd not be exaggerating here. It was not a great place to be. But again, that's exactly what the king wanted. He wanted a really wild party to make all the people forget about all the troubles that were going on outside the city walls, and it was working like a charm. Now, by the way, I got to thinking about this, and you know what it reminded me of? It's what all of us do, by the way, but especially lost people. When you start having issues and you start having things going on in your life, what do? We try to deflect, don't we? We don't want to. We never want to admit things are bad. We don't ever want to admit that things are turning upside down in their heads. So we'll do anything and everything we can to distract us and others from what's really going on, right? We do it in our own lives. We do it in our own families. You don't want the spouse to know something's going on, and so you distract them and you buy them a present. You don't want. There's so many ways you can apply this to, but it's just like human nature. Things are not great outside the walls, but hey, as long as we focus, as long as we're having a good time right now, we don't have to worry about what's going to come later, what could possibly come later. It's the eat, drink, and be merry mentality. It's the you only live once mentality. So live it up, have a blast, have a ball. Who cares what's going to happen in years to come? Who cares what's going to happen in eternity or after I die? I'm going to live it up now, right? And all they're doing is distracting themselves, and we are distracting ourselves from what is to come. It's a ploy of the devil Now, it's interesting to note there's one person of particular note that was not there at the party, and that was middle-aged Daniel. Old Daniel was not there. Now, why wasn't he there? Well, he might not have been invited to the party. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. But even if he was, we know he probably would not have gone, right? So where's Daniel at? We don't know exactly. He's probably in his room praying somewhere, right? That's what Daniel liked to do. As we're going to see next chapter, he had a habit to pray 3 times a day. But he's not there. Sooner or later, no doubt, they didn't invite him because sooner or later, anytime that you invite a conservative, fundamental Christian to something like that, what's going to happen? They're going to be offended, right? Hopefully. They're not going to go with the flow. They're going to say something's wrong, and they're going to be a stick in the mud. Who wants a stick in the mud at a big old shindig like this? So they probably didn't even invite old Daniel. And so, better to leave him off the guest list altogether. But as we'll see, Daniel might not have been there at the party, but pretty soon Daniel's about to become the life of the party. Now, Daniel might not have been there at this party, but someone else was, as we see, number 2, a shocking disruption. So in the middle of this scandalous dinner, there is a shocking disruption. Look at verse 5. Now, again, they're eating, drinking, being merry, drinking out of the silver and gold goblets from the temple, drinking wine, having a blast, singing to their gods. And in verse 5, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the 3rd ruler in all the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen. Now more than likely this was not his wife. More than likely this was probably his father Nabonidus' wife. Again, it's all subject to interpretation. By reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Now stop. So they're at this party, having a grand old time, and in the very same hour, all of a sudden, a disembodied hand shows up and begins to start writing with the finger on the wall of the palace, right where they're at. Now you can imagine at first the king probably thinks he's had a little too much to drink, and he thinks, well, I'm seeing stuff. And he turns pale. But eventually he realizes the whole party stopped, because he's not the only one seeing this. Everybody is seeing what's happening. And so it gets so bad. He grows faint. His knees begin to buckle. He almost collapses, the Bible tells us. All because he sees this shocking disruption. Now the finger, just as suddenly as the finger appeared, the finger vanishes, but left behind there were 4 words. And these words were written in Aramaic, which was the trade language of that day. But what did they mean? He had no clue what they meant. So he again followed the same advice that all his predecessors did. They called in all the wisest people, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the magicians, all these people. Come, tell me what these 4 words mean. Tell me what this is all about. And if you do, you'll be honored. I'll give you a necklace. You'll be the 3rd in command in all the kingdom if you just tell me what these 4 words mean. But they couldn't do it. Couldn't figure it out. All the king's men tried, and every single one of them failed. Well, what a way to end the party, right? I mean, this unbelievable party that's being thrown has now come to a screeching halt. Nobody knows what to do. The nobles were baffled. Everybody was baffled at what it all meant. They came to get drunk. They came to have some fun on the side. They hadn't bargained on having this type of disruption happen to them. Now it's getting late, And we don't know if the queen mother had gone to the party and had gone home because it had been so late. We don't know, but eventually word gets back to the queen mother that, hey, something's happened in the banquet hall, and she makes a beeline there, and she says, hey, all these smart guys can't figure it out, but I remember a man who helped out your grandfather, and I know the Bible says father, but again, if you look at the interpretation, it can mean grandfather as well. Helped out your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, on numerous occasions. He's a very smart man. He's wise. The Bible says, verse 12, there's an excellent spirit in him. He has knowledge and understanding. He can interpret dreams. All these things he can do, what a normal man can't do. Why don't you call Daniel? Again, at this point, around 80 years old. He's not the kid anymore that he used to be. And she thought about this strange handwriting. And again, she said, call for Daniel. He has wisdom and insight. The spirit of the holy gods is in him. He will tell you what the writing means. And now, Daniel, who had not been invited to the party before, is now invited to the party, isn't he? Now he shows up, this former slave, once a teenage hostage. Now, as an old man, he served his whole life in the court of the king of Babylon. More than once he's pulled old Nebuchadnezzar out of a jam, hadn't he? Evidently he'd been faithful to God his entire life. Never once that we know of did he compromise in his values, even though he lived his entire adult life holding a secular position in a secular, worldly government and kingdom. He never compromised his beliefs. He never compromised his faith in God. And now he's called for his last act of service to a Babylonian king. You know what I thought about when it came to this, and this thought was not necessarily original with me, but I read an old commentator, an old English commentator who made this point, and he said this. He said, isn't it interesting that when the world throws an orgy, the children of God aren't invited? He said, we don't fit in. Our values would just be a nuisance when the world wants to party. But then he goes on to say, but let a marriage break up, or let cancer hit, or let the children get in trouble, or the career hit the rocks, and then who do they call? They call the faithful men and women who know the Lord. I read that, and it was such a challenge to me. I've told you numerous times, especially when I was growing up, in high school, and I started getting serious with God, that I quit getting invited to certain things when I started getting serious with the Lord, and it used to bother me, no doubt. I mean, who wouldn't, especially when you're a teenager? It bothered me that I wouldn't get invited to the same things that everybody else did. But how much more after the fact, I realized how much they respected me for doing that. And I would have people come, even as a teenager, come and ask me questions and talk to me because they knew there was something different about me. Was I perfect? No. And I was a hypocrite for many of those years, unfortunately. But they knew there was something different about me. I didn't do the same things they did. I didn't hang around the same places, the same people, and say the same things and get involved in the same. I didn't do it. I just wasn't going to. And that's not to toot my horn, but it's to say this fact is true. There's a lot of things when you live for the Lord that you're not going to be invited to in this world. There's a lot of things that you're not going to have the luxury of being able to do. Daniel was not invited to the party. But when God intervened and nobody had the answer, guess what? Suddenly Daniel was the one man everybody in the kingdom wanted to be there. And what a challenge it is to us, especially if you're here and you're a believer, to understand that you never know what kind of influence you can have on somebody. You may think, by the way, you may be the only Christian in your whole workplace. You may be the only Christian in your family, let alone school or whatever, your class, that's trying to live for God. You may be the only one of them. You may feel overlooked. You may feel taken for granted. You may be ridiculed. You may be misunderstood. But let me encourage you to wait for your time. Do not compromise. Do not compromise your integrity and your testimony just for the sake of being invited to certain things or having certain people look at you a certain way. Don't do it. Because when tough times come, and it's not an if, it's a when those tough times come. And when those people who want nothing to do with you every day during the week at work because you're the holier-than-thou Christian who won't tell the same jokes and won't listen to the same music and won't get involved in the same things, and you're at church every time the doors are open, the same ones they want nothing to do with, when everything hits the fan, guess who the one they call first? It's you. It's you. The one who has the integrity. The one who who has stood up for what's right. They notice something different about you. And when that marriage begins to be on the rocks, when they have a child go wayward, when they get a horrible health diagnosis, you're the one they call. They don't have a pastor, most of them probably. They don't go to church. You're the only Christian they see day in and day out. Do not give up. Stand strong. Daniel, do you not think it bothered Daniel a little bit that he wasn't invited to this party? I mean, he was pretty high up in this kingdom already. I'm sure it did a little bit. I mean, just human nature. I mean, it sounds like they're having a good old time. I could have at least been invited, give me, sparkling grape juice or something and let me hang out with everybody, right? I mean, but yet he was not there. Again, don't know exactly why, but he wasn't there. But when everything was turned upside down on its head, and no earthly wisdom could get them out of the situation they were in, they called the Christian. They called the one who had integrity, the one who had morals. And I want to encourage you, don't ever underestimate the power of a godly life. Even when you think nobody is paying attention to you. Even when you think, well, I don't even know why I try, Brother Agent. Everybody's having a good old time. Nobody's trying to live for God like I'm trying to live for God. And that's not a toot your own horn. That's just the truth in our day and age. I don't even know why I try. Understand, the people of the world are watching you. They're watching us. And if we are faithful to the Lord, when trouble comes, they will know who to call. And then when they call, guess what? We have the honor and the privilege and the opportunity to point them to Jesus. What an awesome responsibility that is. Do not ever take that for granted. Daniel was not the life of the party originally, but now he is the center of attention only because of his integrity and his commitment to the Lord. So they called Daniel, and Daniel comes on the scene, and as he always did, he did not shy away from the opportunity in front of him to make a stand for God. And he gives Belshazzar, number 3, a very straightforward denouncement. A straightforward denouncement. They call him in, Daniel. What do these words mean? Daniel could have blown smoke to the king and said, you know what, king, I'm not 100% sure. Don't worry about it. He could have lied and said whatever he wanted to, but just like Daniel always did, as a man of integrity, he told him exactly what it meant. Look at verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretation and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet. Same deal here with the other guys. If you tell me the interpretation, you get scarlet clothes, a chain of gold about your neck, and you'll be the third ruler in the kingdom. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Now stop. When I read that, I don't think Daniel was a cocky fellow. I don't think he had a lot of self-confidence. I believe he had confidence in God. But isn't it interesting that again, one of the greatest earthly kings at that time, maybe the greatest earthly king at that time, is now offering Daniel a third place position in all the kingdom, and gold and scarlet like a royalty. And what does Daniel do? He just rubs his nose at it and says, you can keep that stuff. I don't need it. You keep it. I don't want it. But he says, still, I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. This was not one of those guys doing it for the money, was he? Some people, I've heard some people say the reason Daniel held these positions in the court was because it was financial gain for him. You read Daniel's life, and there was nothing about him that shows he was doing what he did because of financial gain or because of the prosperity he would get from it. He was doing it because that's where God wanted him to be. He was serving God faithfully. And this king offers him third in line to the throne almost, and he says, don't need it. I'm good. You keep it. And I'll still tell you the interpretation. Verse 18. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty and glory and honor. He's giving him a little history lesson, right? It's been about 20 years. He's giving him a history lesson. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. But here's the reminder: when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And again, let's go a little bit further. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God in the kingdom of men, and that that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. He says, you knew this story. You know your family told you this story when you were young, and yet you've not remembered it. You've forgotten it all. The story of, hey, your grandfather got to be too prideful, and God had to put him in his place. You should know better. Isn't it interesting, though, that many times when a family has a history of mental illness or dark secrets hidden in the family, they don't talk about them a whole lot, do they? You don't want to talk about those things, do you? You want to hide them. Like the skeletons in the closet. You want to bury them as far back as you can. No doubt, I'm sure, in this family full of greedy and ambitious people, who wants to talk about 7 years of one of their elders living like an animal, eating grass? Probably not a very popular thing to talk about around the dinner table. He says, you've forgotten. You've forgotten where you come from. Verse 23, but you've lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee. And thou and thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and of gold, of brass, of iron, wood, and stone. And look at what he says, a little jab here. He says, which see not, nor hear, nor know. You brought in goblets from the temple of the Most High God, whom Nebuchadnezzar understood by the end of his life, to drink wine and sing songs of praise to a bunch of idols made out of rubbish that can't see, can't hear, and can't think. How foolish. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, thou hast not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written, many, many, tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. By the way, he said, I didn't want the stuff, but they gave it to him anyway, didn't they? So he comes in, he reminds the king of what's happened to him, and he says, here's the problem, O Belshazzar. You have not humbled yourself. Verse 22, you have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. Even though you knew the history, you didn't learn from it. You should have known better. You're drinking wine out of the goblets of the Most High God to a bunch of statues that can't even hear you singing. How foolish. He says, I'll tell you what the interpretation is. 4 words. Mene, mene, tekel, parson. Mene means numbered. He says, God has numbered the days of your reign, and guess what, big boy? Your number is up. Your number has been called. Tekel means weighed. God has weighed your life in the scales of justice, and you've come up short, O king. You do not measure up. And the last word is parson. And by the way, those of you who are really sharp and you're paying attention, you'll notice when with the words that were written, it says many, many tekel upharsin, and now it just says farsin at the end. Is it 2 different words that the Bible won't know? The U is actually, it's basically like an and, okay? So when it's written up there, it's and farsin. So here we have the farsin, and it means divided. Your number's up, you've been weighed and balanced, and you don't measure up, and now your kingdom is about to be divided. Your kingdom is about to be broken up. Those were the mysterious messages that God had for him and his life was about to be over. Now you can imagine the king probably sobered up very quickly hearing that news. He probably said, well, I don't like that too much. He may even believe that Daniel was telling the truth. He ordered that purple robe and the necklace, and he told everybody Daniel was now 3rd in command, the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. You know, I mentioned earlier, Daniel could have softened the warning, couldn't he? He could have said, oh, well, it just means, you're this in line of the king. No, he could have, but he didn't. Daniel never missed an opportunity to stand courageous for the Lord. What a great reminder for us. Don't miss those opportunities. Don't ever compromise, no matter how small you think it is. Daniel could have read it and knew what it meant and said, well, you know what, he's going to die anyway tonight. Who cares what I say? But he still told the truth because it was important. He told the truth no matter how difficult it was. And by the way, we should share the same heavenly perspective that Daniel did, because we'll find if we'll stand up for Him that God will give us that courage to stand strong. It's difficult to tell a loved one that they're on their way to hell. That's hard. It's hard. But it's necessary. It's necessary for our loved ones and co-workers and friends to understand that there is a God in heaven who rules. And that we in and of ourselves don't measure up. And that our days are numbered, just like Belshazzar's were. And there's going to come a time where we're going to stand before God in judgment for everything that we've ever done. And if we don't have a relationship with Him, then it's all going to be for nothing. Daniel had no problem telling the king these words. I know we struggle with fear of rejection and fear of not knowing enough, but I cannot implore you enough. It is necessary that every person that claims the name of Christ to have the same courage that Daniel had. That courage doesn't come from inside of us. By the way, that courage did not come from inside of Daniel. That courage came from God. And Daniel was able to stand firm and say, hey, here's what the truth is. No matter how difficult, here's what the truth is. And we have to be that same way, because we live in a lost world around people that are on their way to hell all around us. And if we don't do it, who will? Well, the answer is nobody will. Nobody will. All the smartest people in the kingdom of that day couldn't interpret that message, but Daniel could. There's a lot of smart people in our world today who are just as lost on their way to hell as everybody else. I'm not against science, by the way. I'm all for science. I just don't believe that science is caught up with God in a lot of ways. I'm all for science. But so many people have explained God away with science, and that's not what science is intended to be or ever intended to be. We know the truth, and we have to make the truth known to those around us. Well, the last point is the shortest one by far. It didn't take long for Daniel's prophecy to come true. As we see number 4, a sudden damnation. Look at verse 30, 2 verses. In that night, that very same night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain. And Darius the Median, who we're going to see in the next chapter, took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, the story comes to a close very quickly. And it was a fantastic party. A crazy disruption. Daniel comes on the scene and tells it like it is and says, hey, your days are numbered. Well, your number's been called. Literally, tonight it's been called. That's all we know. But guess what? Secular history, again, fills us in on the details. Let me tell you what happened. That very same night, as I told you, the army of the Medes and the Persians was outside of the gates, just waiting. Well, we know from history they camped near the Euphrates River. Remember, they had dug a channel to run the Euphrates under the city, so they didn't have to go out for any supplies. They were self-contained. They were good to go. Well, the Medes and Persians came up with a plan to block their little channel that they had. And guess what happened? The water kept flowing. Well, when the water quit flowing, and when the water quit flowing underneath the walls of the gates, guess what? That opened up a place for them to go in and to destroy the people of Babylon. And that one night, the entire city was overtaken. One ancient writer even says that when the army entered the city, they found the Babylonians feasting in a time of drunken revelry. Isn't that interesting? Well, of course, we know it's true because the Bible says that it's true. I've read one account that says there was hardly even a sword even had to be swung. The Babylonians didn't even have time to get their stuff because they were all too busy partying. Pretty easy battle for the Medes and the Persians to win. The Medo-Persian army entered Babylon almost without a fight. And before sunrise, Belshazzar was dead, and the Babylonian Empire had come to an inglorious end. Let me draw to conclusion here the moral of the story, if you will. Daniel 5:22 reminds us that Belshazzar knew the past. He knew the story of his grandfather being filled with pride and it leading to him being humbled, and yet he did nothing about it. He did not humble himself. And what Daniel's saying is, you should have known better. You should have known better. When you took the silver and gold goblets and you used them in the orgy, you were practically declaring war on God. You're practically daring God to do something, to punish you, and God called your bluff. God called your bluff. Really, you can sum it up this way. Babylon became great because of the sovereign blessings of God. When they became great, guess what? Like many times happens, their pride made them forget God. When they forgot God, they began to take Him for granted. And then number 4, when they took Him for granted, God judged them and they no longer were a great nation. We see this happen all over our world, by the way. I think I see it happening even in America, do we not? A country that was made great, and I still believe it's the greatest country on earth, but a country that was made great because of God, and we've gotten so great, too great for our own good, and guess what happens? We start to leave God out of the equation. We start to push Him out. We start to promote all the men of science and smart people, and we leave out the religious people as a pariah. They're not invited to the party anymore. And they push God out, and guess what? There comes a time, as in all these situations, that God has and will humble our nation, as He already has to an extent. I believe even more so is coming. So what do we learn from all this? Well, number 1, if I can encourage you one thing, remember that God's Word is always true, and it's sure. If God says something's going to happen, it's going to happen. God is always right. I mean, think about, He 100% talked about everything that was going to happen in all these stories we talked about in the book of Daniel. But we know the Bible says He's coming again one day, right? I believe that's going to happen. It hasn't happened yet, but I still believe, just as sure as the sun comes up in the morning, that it's going to happen. That means it's important for us to make sure that we're right with Him. The second thing it reminds me of is that God's punishment is sure. His judgment is sure. I hope you understand God is a patient God, and I'm thankful for His patience. I'm thankful that God is a God of second, third, and 30th chances sometimes, right? But there will come a day where every number will be called. There's coming a day for every single one of us. You think, well, Brother H, I've lived like this for so long and I haven't seen any punishment yet. It's coming. It may not always be the way that you think, but I promise you, judgment is coming. I'm thankful for the patience of God. But again, like all, I don't want to say God's patience wears thin because God is unlimited in all of His attributes. But the Bible tells us that you reject His light long enough, He'll quit giving you light. So there's coming a day for all of you and all of us that time's coming. So I want to encourage you, if you're in a position where you think, I'm living it up right now, brother, when I get a little bit older, then I'll start getting serious with God. No, do not put it off. Because you don't know when your number is going to be drawn. Do not put it off. And the final thing is this: God weighs every human heart. This is a message for all of us, Christians and non-Christians alike. We know from the Scriptures that God scrutinizes every human heart. Yes, does He look at our outward actions? Of course He does. But what He cares about much more than that is our hearts. He knows our motivations. He knows our thoughts. He knows our dreams. He knows our secrets. Nothing is hidden from Him. And so just like Belshazzar was held accountable for what he knew about King Nebuchadnezzar and didn't do about it, guess what? We are held responsible for everything we have received in our lives. Maybe you're here and you were raised in church like I am and grew up in church, been in church your whole life. I believe we're going to be held a lot more accountable than those who were not. We have what excuse do we have? There are lost people out there who've never entered the doors of a church. And they're going to be judged, rightfully so, as we all are. But we who know the truth have no excuse for not living for Him. Now, their excuse is not going to fly with God, don't get me wrong. But it's our job to go and tell them so they won't have an excuse either. We need to make sure that we go and tell them, to whom much is given, much is required. Listen to me, today is the day of salvation. Do not put it off. I mentioned a minute ago that God, the only promise that God's given us that has not come to fulfillment is His returning, His second coming. I can't wait for that day. I've often joked, being the dad of 4 girls, that I hope that comes sooner than later before it gets to the teenage years, right? And I say that jokingly, but I'm serious. I really want. I cannot wait for God's return. And I know we think, it could be, and it could be 100 years, it could be 1,000 years, it could be 10 years, it could be right now. You don't know. Are you ready? Are you ready for Him? If not, do not put it off. Today is the day of salvation. Today is the day for you to learn from your past mistakes, to learn from the Word of God that's always right and always true, and to make things right with God today. And then secondly, if you're here today and you are a Christian, we have a responsibility. We know who's in control. We know who's always right and who is always true. We're going to stand before God too, so make sure you're right. We have such a responsibility to tell the truth with courage to those around us. Talk about inviting somebody to homecoming. That is the least of what we should be doing. Some of you, when I say that, you're thinking, I can't invite somebody to come. I'm nerve-wracked. Listen, if you can't invite somebody to come to homecoming for a free meal and a free singing, you're never going to tell them about a eternal hell that's waiting for them if they don't trust in Christ. Never going to happen. Let's get off of our hands. Let's get off of our rears. Let's get off of our words and go and tell those around us who are lost on their way to hell about a God who is good, about a God who loves us immensely to send His Son and die for us. Ever had that?